Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, and in this programme we will be talking about the 30th anniversary of signing of the Oslo Accords, that is the Israeli agreement with the PLO, the Palestinians, on the White House lawn that took place on the 13th of September 1993. That looked like it was going to bring in a new dawn of peace and prosperity for the Middle East, that this decades-old conflict between the Israelis and the Arabs would come to an end. But the reality was completely different. We saw that the peace turned sour, and instead what Yasser Arafat, as the chairman of the PLO, did was to create a Palestinian infrastructure of terrorism. He indoctrinated an entire generation of Palestinian Arabs to hate Israel and to work against Israel for Israel's destruction, but also believed that the Oslo Accords was also God's prophetic warning for a future time where Israel will sign a false peace with a man of lawlessness that would lead to the great tribulation mentioned in the book of Revelation. And tonight I'm joined by my good friend, who's now a co-host, Hugh Kitson.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here.
So, Hugh, you've been on the Middle East Report, you've been on a few other programmes, so it's great to have you on Behind Headlines as we unpack the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords. I know from your perspective that you've spent decades producing films and documentaries about the history of Israel, but why do you think the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords, or the Declaration of Principles on the White House lawn, is so significant and so important?
Well, we're feeling the effects of it today. It was certainly detrimental for Israel. Do you know, I remember my first trip to Israel nearly 50 years ago now, just after the Yom Kippur War of September 1973, and I was there in 74, January. And in those days, you could drive anywhere in the land of Israel. I visited Joseph's tomb in Nablus. Shechem is the ancient. I went into Hebron, and you could go pretty well everywhere without too much trouble. Not today, really, from 1993 onwards.
No, it's extraordinary, isn't it? So just to remind you that this programme, we are marking the 30th anniversary of the Israeli-Palestinian peace accords, known as the Oslo Accords, that were signed on the White House lawn on the 13th of September 1993. We saw that this was signed between the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, his Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, together with the chairman of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, under the patronage of US President Bill Clinton, with world leaders in attend, and there we have the US Secretary of State there. The international community and the world's press corps believe that this new peace treaty with Israel and the Palestinians would usher in a new dawn of peace and prosperity to the Middle East, and the decades-old conflict between the Israelis and the Arabs would come to an end. This historic agreement quickly turned sour from peace to terrorism, as the Jewish state had to face a frightening new reality of suicide bombings that brought bloodshed on the streets of Israel's major cities, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And instead of peace, Israel and the Jewish nation got terrorism, hatred, indoctrination, incitement, promotion of worldwide anti-Semitism, delegitimization of the State of Israel, the illegal Palestinian settlements in Area C, radicalization of Israeli Arabs, institutional corruption of the Palestinian Authority that has been a detrimental impact on the Palestinian people themselves. And of course, this comes as a warning in the book of Revelation about the false peace that Israel will sign with the man of lawlessness. Now, because we got so much to unpack in such a short time, we can't really go into so much of the historical overview of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and if we can, we certainly can go to your documentaries. But do you want to start off with the formation of the PLO that occurred on the 28th of May 1964, Hugh?
Right. Well, the Soviets were very much involved in that, and what they wanted to do was to destabilize the whole Middle East. Now, they voted for the partition and the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, hoping it would be a socialist state, and in one sense it was, but they were hoping to be a real ally to the Soviets, and it didn't turn out that way, so they destabilized the whole thing, and they were instrumental in the formation of the PLO for just that purpose. Now, just after the Yom Kippur War, you had the phase plan. Oslo actually goes back in its intention quite a bit earlier, and Mahmoud Abbas, who is the current chairman of the PLO, for how much longer we don't know, he introduced this phase plan whereby they weren't going to try and take the whole of the land from the river to the sea in one go. They were going to try and do it through peace. You could almost spell the peace process P-I-E-C-E rather than what we would understand as a peace process. And this was part of the strategy of entering into the Oslo Accords to start with.
Which is extremely interesting, and also that I think this was due to meetings that the Mahmoud Abbas and the leadership of the PLO had at the time then with the Viet Cong, and seeing how they managed to turn the war and turn American public opinion against the American war in Vietnam. So they used those, and that's one of the major suggestions. They said that you won't win international support for the elimination of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. Take the land, take as much territory as you can first, and destroy Israel in stages. So I think you're absolutely right, Hugh, that was the beginning of this one. But it's also important that many of our kind of media, mainstream media coverage of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs really focuses after 1967, saying that Israel's possession of Judea and Samaria is the main reason why we have Palestinian terrorism against Israel, that this is a land dispute. But when we actually see that the PLO was formed in Egypt in 1964, that's 3 years before the Six-Day War.
Absolutely it was. And they actually changed their charter in 1967-68, actually they changed it, after Israel had recaptured Judea, Samaria and Gaza, and of course Jerusalem, because the intention wasn't to try and conquer land that Egypt and Jordan were occupying in Gaza and what they had renamed as the West Bank. But once Israel had recaptured that territory, their aim was to eventually take over the whole land between the river and the sea.
Regarding my notes here, which is very important, so we see that, for example, the PLO has been involved in terrorism. They're known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, under the leadership of Chairman Yasser Arafat, has been responsible for a number of hijackings, shootings, bomb explosions, including Munich and Entebbe. But their first terrorist attack occurred on the 1st of January 1965, when the PLO tried to blow up Israel's national water carrier. Can you just unpack a little bit for us and our viewers as well, Hugh, the legacy of terrorism that the PLO had and the mayhem that they caused pretty much in the late 60s and 1970s, particularly with the hijacking of aircraft, the kidnapping of diplomats and murder and shooting of Jews and Israelis across the world.
Yes, and by the way, in September of 1970, the PLO tried to overthrow the Jordanian government and get rid of King Hussein, which resulted in their expulsion to Lebanon, and then they created mayhem there as well. So, I mean, it really was a terrorist organization. It grew up as a terrorist organization, and I have to say it's still a terrorist organization to this day. But what I find quite incomprehensible is how Israel came to be, to accept them as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. And largely there was pressure there from the European nations, because they had entered into an understanding with the Arab League following the Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo, that is what they would do. They would pressure Israel into accepting the PLO, which is what happened. One of the things that happened just before Oslo was the Madrid conference in 1991, and Yitzhak Shamir was then the prime minister, and he refused to have anything to do with the PLO whatsoever. In fact, it was a criminal offence in Israel to do that, to meet with the PLO and have any connection with them. And somehow they got forced into, with the Oslo Accords, in recognising the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, when in fact they had virtually no connection with the Palestinian people who were actually living in the land at that time.
No, I think that's a very important point you make, Hugh. Also, we have to understand that we have to put this in historical context. So firstly, the major reason why we saw the emergence of the Oslo Accords was the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and that left America as the sole remaining world superpower. And then, of course, the other thing was the Gulf War of 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990. The PLO and Yasser Arafat then backed Saddam Hussein, which angered the Arab world. So we see that the PLO became isolated within the Arab world, and because they tried to overthrow the King Hussein of Jordan in 1970, as you mentioned. The PLO was then kicked out to Lebanon, created a civil war in Lebanon, and it took an Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 to kick the PLO out. They were accepted in Tunisia, and this is where the PLO was stationed during the Gulf War, was in Tunisia. And of course, you mentioned the first Madrid conference on the 30th of October 1991. But really was the election of the Labour leader, Yitzhak Rabin, as Israel's prime minister in 1992, and the surprise election victory of Bill Clinton in November 1992 that really led to the Oslo Accords.
Yep. That's absolutely true, yeah.
And I suppose the other aspect we have to talk about, and this is the big question regarding Oslo, Hugh, is why did Rabin attempt to make peace with Yasser Arafat and the PLO, knowing that the PLO was destitute, was in Tunisia, was financially broken because they backed the wrong horse during the Gulf War. And here we are, the PLO are completely isolated. None of the terrorist members of the PLO and the leadership of the PLO had ever lived in the Palestinian Authority, before that, Judea and Samaria, what is now the Palestinian Authority, had ever lived there before. And here we are, Israel signing an historic peace agreement with their arch enemies.
It does beg a belief, but I do believe that the Europeans and the Arab League were exerting pressure on Israel at that time, and I think that had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, what you said as well, how the Europeans, because of the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and the Arab League, then adopted this policy of supporting the Palestinian cause with no questions asked, wanting to create the establishment of a Palestinian state, East Jerusalem as its capital. We really see that the Clinton administration, that of the centre-left in America, followed Europe's lead on this one, didn't they, for the first time?
They did, yes. And even though they weren't, the Americans, at that time weren't openly talking about a state, the understanding that Europe had with the Arab League was that a state would be created. And as we'll see, the Oslo agreements themselves doesn't even mention a state.
So we got an exclusive here for Behind Headlines, thanks to Hugh Kitson, and this is a new extract of his new documentary looking at the Oslo Accords, and this is from Whose Land?
Suddenly, in September 1993, the world's media were proclaiming a new era of peace in the Middle East. In a historic and controversial move, Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, which had committed numerous terrorist atrocities.
The status of Jerusalem, they say, this is a matter which is going to be negotiated. So I don't believe that the Oslo agreements in any way waive or contravene or undermine or change the status of Jerusalem prior to 1993. Interestingly, the Oslo Agreement does not talk about Palestinian statehood. It doesn't say that a Palestinian state will be created. It simply says that Israel agrees to enter into a process to resolve the conflict.
There's never been any legal commitment, legal document, treaty, agreement, contract, or formal binding resolution that's determined that the territories belong to the Palestinians, or that they're under Palestinian sovereignty, or that they're Palestinian.
A number of issues were explicitly reserved for final status agreement, and those included the status of Jerusalem, it included the status of the settlements, and these were all matters that Israel and the PLO agreed to negotiate. But it never says that all of the West Bank will ultimately belong to the Palestinians. That was a matter for negotiation.
Today, some 3 decades on from the original signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, its provisions have been conveniently forgotten by the Palestinian Arabs. In 1995, Israel and the PLO signed a further interim agreement that became known as Oslo II, which gave the Palestinian Arabs autonomous government in parts of Judea and Samaria, which include Bethlehem behind me.
In the Oslo Accords, the Israelis and Palestinians agreed that to divide the areas pending a final status, a permanent status agreement, to divide the areas into 3 areas, A and B, which are the main Palestinian towns and villages, which will be transferred by Israel to the Palestinian Authority, which was set up in order to administer these areas, and Area C, which is an area that's sparsely populated, but it contains Israel's military installations and settlements, and this would remain under the jurisdiction and control of Israel. The Palestinians agreed to this. In legal terms, it's called lex specialis. In other words, it's a special legal regime that overcomes all other legal regimes. So it's prior to the Geneva Convention or anything else, because it's agreed upon between the Israelis and the Palestinians that areas A and B, they will rule those areas, and they will legislate, and they have their court and their parliament and whatever. And in Area C, Israel will continue to administer this area from all points of view until there's a permanent status. And it says specifically in the Oslo Accords that each side has the freedom to do planning, zoning and construction in the areas under its control, which basically means that the Palestinians can build what they want in their areas, and Israel can build whatever it wants in its areas. And there's no limitation in the Oslo Accords on settlement activity or building or anything like that.
And this week's special guest for Behind the Headlines is no other than Dr. Mordecai Kedar himself, one of the world's leading experts in Islam and also in Arab affairs. Mordecai, warm welcome to Behind the Headlines from Israel today.
Thank you for having me here, Mr. Barrett.
Pleasure. And Mordecai, what are your thoughts as we mark the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords, the agreement between Israel and the then PLO that became the Palestinian Authority?
Just a little correction, the PLO still exists, and it is actually the owner of the Palestinian Authority. It did not dismantle itself. It still exists with all its institutions, including the PA. So the PLO is still fighting for the liberation of Palestine. As they say, it means the whole country from the river to the sea. And I have a little proof that this is what the goal is. let me show you the scarf which they carry in their demonstrations. This is the PLO flag. The PLO flag is this, and the land is the entire land. And this is what they still go around in their demonstrations, and this is the whole land. On the other side of this scarf, they show this, and they say El-Quds Lana, means Jerusalem is ours. Since when Jerusalem is theirs? But this is what they claim. And as a result, the whole thing will be Palestine, as it says here, Palestine. And they know the connection, because without Zion, there is no Zionism. And this is why they demand Jerusalem in order to empty this country from its Jewish content. And this is the essence of our struggle, because they don't accept yet. 30 years into these agreements, the PLO and the Hamas and all the other Palestinian organizations have not yet crossed this Rubicon to accept the mere existence of the state of Israel, even if it was on a square centimeter on the seashore of Tel Aviv. And this is a problem which, unfortunately, here in Israel, people do not get it. So this is actually agreements which did not fulfill neither of their expectations. The one expectation was that after 5 years of interim term, there will be two states living peacefully. Even those who advocated for the Oslo agreements believed and worked in order to establish a Palestinian state side by side near Israel, living together. It didn't happen until today. Means 25 years later, there is still no Palestinian state, unlike what they intended. Secondly, the Palestinian Authority and the agreements did not succeed to get rid of the problem of terror, which is in our streets, even in Tel Aviv and wherever. They didn't succeed. It's a total failure. The third problem is that the assumption that these agreements will bring peace and mutual recognition between Israel and the rest of the Arab world and the Islamic world never became true. It was a dream. It was an intention of some Israelis who are oblivious of the issues of the Middle East and Islam, and they believe that if we only solve the problem with the Palestinians, all the other Arab and Islamic countries will stand in line near our door in order to make peace and normalization with us. The fourth pre-assumption, which was not fulfilled, is that these agreements did not reduce the campaign to delegitimize Israel, neither in the Middle East nor in the global arena. Only to find today, 30 years later, that anti-Semitism is way much more severe compared to what it was 30 years ago. And this is thanks to the propaganda which the PLO disseminates all over the world against the Jewish state. And therefore, all the four pre-assumptions of the engineers of Oslo actually came like nothing and did not fulfill these hopes.
Mordecai, I remember reading a document a couple of decades ago, which was about Shimon Peres, one of the architects of the Oslo Accords, former Israeli Prime Minister, Foreign Minister at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords, where the document stated that the peace agreement with the PLO was more about a unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria than it was a peace process, but it was sold to the Israeli public as a peace process. Can you just share with us your thoughts on that revelation?
It's not only this. First of all, it's correct. Second, it's not only this. The Oslo agreements were signed in 1993 as a result of 2 devastating years which we had in that time of the first Intifada, after 3 Israeli soldiers were kidnapped by Hamas and the Jihad, were murdered by them, and buried in places which nobody knew. So it became a big issue in this country. What are these organizations doing to us? So the government, when they signed the Oslo Agreement, they said that Arafat will deal with the Islamic Jihad and the Hamas without the Supreme Court and without the human rights organizations, which actually restricted the action of the IDF against the Hamas and the Jihad. And this is actually how it was sold to us, as a way how the PLO will come and fight the terrorism against Israelis, as was demonstrated by the kidnapping of these 3 soldiers by the Hamas and the Jihad. And unfortunately, Arafat, when he established the PA, he didn't have even the smallest intention to do this job. If Israel cannot fight the Hamas and the Jihad because of the Supreme Court and because of the organizations of human rights, so let Israel go to hell. And this is actually what he meant. He didn't, for 1 minute, he didn't think to be a traitor of the Palestinians and work seriously or act seriously against the Islamic Jihad and the Hamas. While to us, Peres and Rabin and other, Beilin and others who believed in this, sold it to us as if Arafat will fight against the Hamas and against the Jihad.
And Mordecai, how did Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, arch-terrorist with countless number of Jewish blood on his hands, was able to deceive Yitzhak Rabin into signing what is known as the Oslo Accords, or the Declaration of Principles? And can you just elaborate on how this was part of Yasser Arafat's phase plan to destroy Israel in phases through peace?
First of all, he did not kill only Israelis. He was recorded by the American National Security Agency, the NSA, ordering people in Sudan to murder 3 diplomats, 1 American and 2 Europeans, I think, who were kidnapped by the PLO or friends of the PLO in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and he was recorded by the National Security Agency ordering the people in Sudan to kill those diplomats. So later, when he was invited to the lawn of the White House in September 1993 to sign the Oslo Agreements, these recordings disappeared. Okay? So Arafat was legitimized not only by Israel, but also by the United States. You know, in English you said, if you need a thief, you take him off from the rope. Okay? So they needed him. They thought, well, they believed that if Israel relies on this man to fight against terror of the Hamas and the Jihad, so if Israel is making peace with him, who are we, the Americans, to say that the Israelis are mistaken? So the problem started here with the Israeli left, who were deceived by Arafat, who makes them believe that this is a real peace. While in Arabic, he constantly said that this is a Hudaybiyah peace. Hudaybiyah peace means temporary peace with the infidel, which can last only as long as the infidel is too powerful, and too invincible to be defeated. So the Muslims are allowed to give him temporary peace, and this is actually what was the Oslo Agreements, and Arafat said it again and again in Johannesburg and in many other places. It was recorded on site, and whoever in Israel wanted to know knew that Arafat means only a temporary peace, only because Israel is too powerful. and he will continue the war whenever he feels that Israel is weak. And this happened in May 2000, when Israel ran away from Lebanon under the leadership of Ehud Barak, the one who today is making the country crazy by the demonstrations and many other things. And he, the biggest failure of a prime minister, decided to run away from Lebanon in May 2000. And Arafat understood that Israel is very weak because of this. And in September 2000, he started the second intifada, hoping that Israel will run away also from the land of Israel, either partially or completely. Just like Israel ran away from Lebanon because of terror of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So, in a way or another, the Israel withdrawal, shameful withdrawal from, you can maybe compare it to the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, from Kabul, which we saw a couple of years ago. Really shameful thing what happened there. And the result, the Taliban took Afghanistan in no time. And the same thing happened in Lebanon. We came out in such a shameful way. And Hezbollah, actually today, are the rulers of Lebanon.
Yeah. Mordecai, so my final question, because we're running out of time. I could do a whole program with you, and I'd love to do a whole program with you. But 30 years on, what would you say is the legacy of the Oslo Accords?
The legacy of the Oslo Accords is to listen to what our enemies say in Arabic, not in Hebrew, not in English, but in Arabic, and to believe them when they say that this is only a deception, and not to say to us, to the citizens, that this is only for domestic consumption. These sayings that this is only a temporary. This is how our government talked those days. That Arafat relates to these agreements as temporary agreements only for domestic consumption. And he, in matter of fact, he really means these agreements to be forever. No, it was a lie. He didn't for 1 minute, he didn't mean to give us any agreement which will legitimize the mere existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. Not for 1 minute. But our leaders, unfortunately, said what they said. And the media, which those years, we didn't have internet and as it is today, the mainstream media, which was the only media, actually echoed the government and what Peres said and what Rabin said and what Balin said. And they echoed only one side of the political map, ignoring the majority maybe of the people who opposed these agreements.
Dr. Mordecai Kedar, I just want to thank you so much for joining us from Israel today. Thank you so much for unpacking your incredible knowledge and insight as we mark the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords.
Thank you, Simon, for having me, and see you again.
Thank you so much. So the Oslo Accords, known as the Declarations of Principles, were signed on the White House lawn on the 13th of September 1993, nearly 30 years ago. And Yitzhak Rabin famously said, "Enough of war and bloodshed, enough," shook hands with his arch enemy Yasser Arafat, and the world believed that this would usher in a new era of peace and prosperity for the Middle East. We see that the signing of the Declaration of Principles meant that the Israeli government had to recognize the PLO as the sole representatives of the Palestinian people, and this had huge implications for the indigenous Arab populations living in Judea, Samaria and Gaza. An interesting document was produced a few years ago that stated that Shimon Peres, the main architect of the Oslo Accords, when he was Israel's foreign minister at the time, sold the Oslo Accords to the Israeli people as a peace process when it in fact was a unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria. It was not until 1994 did we see the Jericho-Gaza agreement. It was which Arafat did not actually want Gaza, so he was given Jericho as well. So we saw the IDF withdraw from these cities in 1994 and then became governed by the Palestinian Authority with the establishment of an armed Palestinian police force. Israel did not learn from its lessons from Lebanon, and the implementation of the Palestinian phase plan to destroy Israel was started to be implemented. Again, in 1994 and 1995, the IDF pulled out of major biblical towns and cities in Judea and Samaria and handed them over to the Palestinian Authority. Did Rabin know that the plan of Oslo Accords would be to create a Palestinian state, and how this would endanger Israel? We don't know. Israel, before he was assassinated in October of 1995, Israel gave up her biblical heritage and was rewarded with terrorism. The first wave of suicide bombings occurred in Israel in 1994, and in April the 13th, 1994, 5 people were killed in a suicide bombing attack on a bus in a central bus station in Hadera, and Hamas claimed responsibility for this attack. Arafat used the billions of dollars in foreign aid to build a terrorist infrastructure of terrorism and incite an entire generation on hatred and violence against Israel. And in the summer of 2000, at Camp David, just outside of Washington, D.C., under the leadership of Bill Clinton, Israel's Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Yasser Arafat a Palestinian state with 85% of Judea and Samaria, including East Jerusalem, as the capital of a Palestinian state. Arafat rejected this, which led to the Second Intifada, which leads us on, Hugh, to look at the legacy of the Oslo Accords. What are the legacy of the Oslo Accords 30 years on, of this deceptive peace?
Yes. I mean, really, the legacy is complete mayhem in that part of the Middle East. And not only that, one of the things that's happened as a result is that Israel really is not in control of her own destiny. There's been interference from the United Nations, from the European Union, and actually many of the nations actually behave as if a peace treaty has actually been signed. What the Declaration of Principles did and the interim agreement did was pave the way for a final status agreement, which the Palestinians have never actually completed. Now, under international law, the only country that can cede territory to the Palestinians or anyone else is Israel herself. And by the way, in Leviticus 25:23, the Lord commands the nation of Israel not to sell land permanently to anyone else for whatever reason, because the Lord says this land is mine. So actually, from God's point of view, there was never going to be any blessing on the Oslo Accords. Now, the nations actually behave as if a peace treaty has been signed and the whole land belongs to the Palestinians, and they call it occupied Palestinian territory. And as you just saw with Dr. Alan Baker there, he said there has been no peace treaty, no binding agreement that has been signed that gives the land to the Palestinians. Yes, there have been UN resolutions, but they're not binding. They're done under Chapter 6. So the legacy is that Israel is in real danger of losing the land that God gave them to the Jewish people as an everlasting inheritance.
Right, I'm just going to read
That's been a legacy.
an extract of an excellent article. This is according to Dr. Yael Litter, who is the Director General of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, wrote an excellent opinion piece entitled The Oslo Accords Unintended Consequences. He says, since the signing of the Oslo Accords in September 1993, consecutive Israeli governments have enacted a policy of tolerance and restraint with regard to the egregious Palestinian Authority violations of those agreements, despite sustained delegitimization and demoralization and demonization of Israel, the use of anti-Semitic tropes, a nihilist language, and financial payments to Palestinian terrorists and their families, Israel has not extracted a price for this enduring malevolence behaviour. And let's have a look at the second part of this extract from Whose Land that looks back to the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords.
So yes, I grew up in Israel in what is called the Israeli left, the Labour Party. I grew up very much believing that the conflict was about Palestinian statehood, drawing borders, settlements, and very much believed that the day that the Palestinians would have a chance to have a state of their own in the West Bank and Gaza is the day we would have peace.
The Oslo Accords were very divisive within Israel, both within society itself and politically. Most people on the so-called right wing of the political divide were ideologically opposed to the idea of land for peace, believing that ceding any of Israel's historic heartland to the PLO would be like allowing a Trojan horse into their midst. That has certainly proved to be the case. However, the majority of people on the left, like Dr. Einat Wilf, believed, as she does to this day, that the way ahead is to show good faith to the people known as the Palestinians in order to bring peace. This is exactly what Israel embarked on with the Oslo Accords.
In my view personally, even though Israel has a claim and legitimate claim to the land, it should, as an act of goodwill, make it clear that it's renouncing its claim for most of it in order to demonstrate the notion that peace will be achieved when both sides recognize that they cannot have it all.
In the year 2000, US President Bill Clinton met with Yasser Arafat and the then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak at Camp David in Maryland. The aim? To bring about a negotiated final status agreement under Oslo. Dr. Einat Wilf was an advisor to the then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres at the time of the Oslo negotiations in the early 1990s.
The 90s in that respect were a time of euphoria for me. I felt that we were finally putting... in 2000, in many ways, it all came crashing down. And the years since then have been ones of devastation. Not just for me, for the Israeli left in general.
In 2000 at Camp David, they're talking peace. And everyone thought at that moment, peace is around the corner. In fact, Arafat was already planning the Second Intifada. As soon as he got back home, he walked out. Simply walked out. He'd gone there as a man of peace. He actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for doing it. He won a Peace Prize for going home and starting a war.
In 2000, Yasser Arafat rejected the best deal that he could have possibly got. One has to ask the question, why? Could it be that he would have to abandon the Palestinian national charter that calls for the destruction of the Jewish state? Was it that he wanted to disinherit the Jewish people of their historic and cultural capital, which was recognized as such in international law, without having to make any concessions whatsoever? Was his ultimate aim to rip the heart and soul out of the Jewish people through the international community, compelling them to surrender their ancient capital, which is so central to their cultural, religious, and spiritual identity?
They know that Jerusalem is a weak link in the chain because they know that Jerusalem is actually the center of the Jewish people, and without Jerusalem, there will be no Israel. because without Zion, there is no Zionism. And they know it very well. Unfortunately, too many countries in the world still do not recognize Jerusalem to be part of Israel because they still stick to the partition plan of 1947, which mentions that Jerusalem should be under international government.
The Palestinians tell the world in English that Israel exists, and they recognize its existence, but they will never recognize Israel's right to exist.
From the beginning, and I think until this very day, the main goal of the PLO on the international arena is to undermine the status of Israel as a state among the states in the world, to undermine the recognition which states gave to Israel as a state with the right to exist.
Amongst themselves, they say that they don't recognize Israel on any borders. For external consumption in English, they will claim that they recognize Israel, but they will insist that they won't recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
Everything which they can do in order to weaken Israel and to bring it to its knees. Everything is okay. And this is actually the derivatives of the charter of the PLO.
Moreover, the PLO undertook in the Oslo Accords to renounce terrorism and to amend their founding charter that calls for the liquidation of the State of Israel through armed struggle. Not only does the aim of the destruction of Israel remain the central platform of their charter, but as Israel conceded land for peace through negotiation, Palestinian terrorism actually increased in response.
To have people being blown up, families, children, in cafes, in buses, and it's in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Beersheba, not in the West Bank, not in Gaza. Supposedly nothing controversial about these areas, but this is where families were being targeted and were being killed.
In the next episode of Whose Land, we examine the 2004 opinion of the International Court of Justice in response to the construction of Israel's security barrier to prevent the large-scale murder of its citizens by Palestinian terrorists.
And that's the first time that that extract on the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords has been broadcast anywhere. So you viewers of Revelation TV, you're very blessed, and thanks to Hugh, was able to see that. Well done, Hugh. That the cinema photography was superb, the content was superb, the interviews were excellent. I think it's one of your most outstanding pieces of work yet. But when we look at the legacy of the Oslo Accords, we know that this brought terrorism and violence to Israel. It separated the Israelis from the Palestinian Arabs themselves, that weren't separated, as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. We also saw that through Yasser Arafat, we have maybe 2-3 generations of Palestinian Arab children brought up on a daily diet of hatred and incitement to violence and terrorism against Israel. We also see that this has brought in the boycott, divestments and sanctions, the delegitimization of Israel, the illegal construction of Palestinian settlements in Area C that Israel controls, that's a threat to Israel's security. We've seen the emergence of Hamas as a major threat to the security of the PLO. But the big question, I think, has to be taken that Israel's never held the Palestinian Authority to account for breaking its agreements with the Oslo Accords. And there is a big speculation that the Israelis are fearful that if they made the PA pay a price, then the Palestinian Authority would collapse and an extremist Islamist government would be in its place, or that they would then have to send in the IDF again and control a very hostile Arab population.
Yes, I know the Israelis are frightened of it, but just coming back to the Oslo Accords, the nations of the world, the United Nations, have been complicit in violating the Oslo Accords for the reasons you just mentioned, Palestinian building in Area C, but also with things like Resolution 2334, which we'll be looking at in a future episode. these resolutions from the United Nations are actually a violation of the Oslo Accords, because the Oslo Accords are meant to be finally negotiated between the two parties without interference. Well, of course, part of the PLO ploy has been to internationalize the whole thing. I mean, the truth of the matter is there is not going to be peace between the PLO and Israel ever.
Oh, no, exactly.
And actually, the nations need to come down against the PLO, and it should once again be prescribed as a terrorist organization.
I couldn't agree more with you, and the same can be applied to the EU as well. But where do you think that the Oslo Accords fit into Bible prophecy? Because my kind of analysis of events really, that the Lord allowed the signing of the Oslo Accords as a future warning for Israel about a deceptive peace. The Oslo Accords were a deceptive peace, and so when the man of lawlessness, or known as the Antichrist, the president of a one-world government, signs a peace agreement with Israel that will start the tribulation period, we know that this is the biggest deception the world's ever seen.
Yeah.
And the Israeli government at the time signs up to this agreement.
It is, I believe, a huge warning. Now, when we looked at the Oslo Accords, you had the more religious people who were totally against it, and you had, if you like, the humanist agenda with Shimon Peres. He believed what he was trying to achieve was a sort of unified Middle East from a human perspective. And the ultimate Antichrist basically will be promoting humanism. He will present himself as God in the rebuilt temple on the Temple Mount. And Israel needs to come to a point. The only way that they would avoid deception is if they call upon the Lord. And it is this divide that we're seeing sadly, very sadly in Israel today, between the humanists on the one side and the religious, the God-fearing Jews on the other, that is going to be the defining issue, if you like.
Yeah, and we know from, for example, from also from Daniel, for example, in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 27, and 24, verse 27, together with Isaiah 28, verses 14 and 22, that the Antichrist will form an agreement with Israel, break that agreement after 3.5 years, set himself up as God in the rebuilt Jewish temple. And it seems that the main reason that Israel allows this is one, for security and protection, which is a false peace. So in summing up, Hugh, I think very much that the Oslo Accords is a warning to a future time in Israel when Israel signs a false peace with a false Messiah that will usher in the most darkest period of world history.
Yes, I do believe that that's the case. And I really don't know what the answer to this is, other than turning to the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, because in the end, he is Israel's only defender.
No, exactly. But also we see the need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that constant intercession that's needed for Israel, because we see that the Rabin Peres government of 93 made the historic mistake of signing this agreement in the first place, knowing what the PLO did in Jordan, knowing what they did in Lebanon, and now they've done it in Judea and Samaria, which is an absolute disaster. So Hugh, thank you so much for being my co-host on Behind the Headlines. It's been great to have you on the programme. Appreciate that very much. And I want to thank you for watching at home as we mark the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords, known as the Declaration of Principles. It did not bring peace, but instead brought terrorism, war, violence, incitement to hatred and violence against Israel. And our entire generations are now being brought up on a doctrine of hatred and terrorism against Israel. So we've got to continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and that God would protect his nation and his land at this time as we mark the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.